You know, sometimes you load a game up and you can tell just by the menu that it's going to be something special. The first few hours playing this game were a dive into a presentation so slick and polished that it makes most middle-of-the-road AAA efforts look amateur. The pixel art is smooth and adorable, and these procedural dungeons of hand-designed rooms ensure that the system won't churn out anything unsightly. The game feels fast and responsive with an unlocked frame rate and not a single glitch in sight. The music is a rousing, beautifully layered festival of applauding crowds, and it honestly may be the best soundtrack I've heard this year. There's just no doubt about it. Combine all those elements, and I adore this game's style. I love its doopy little run cycles and the smiley faces plastered all over the place and its abundance of humor. The game's full of energy, it's full of life, it's full of self-aware shoot-and-loot silliness, and I love that. Enter the Gungeon is a top-down shoot-'em-up done in the style of a top-down dungeon crawl-'em-up roguelite. Procedurally generated treasures and power-ups hopefully spawn in, a la Binding of Isaac, and trigger-twitchy gunplay with an unlocked mouse cursor drives the action a la Nuclear Throne. But covering the screen with slow-moving, brightly colored shots from bullet hell shmups, and giving all 4 characters a much-needed difficulty crutch by way of a dodge roll with iframes are the 2 big twists that set Gungeon apart from either one of those. And those 2 influencer games define a genre I haven't really harbored much love for, so keep my weird preferences in mind. I've never really gotten hooked by Isaac or Nuclear Throne. I'm fascinated by Spelunky, but never cared enough to beat it, and probably the only one of these procedural dungeon pilferers I ever really got excited about was last year's Crypt of the Necrodancer, believe it or not. And just like Gungeon, Necrodancer also didn't take a stab at serious world building. It was just a party. Everyone was having a good time. And Gungeon is a party too, with a well-polished presentation of positive vibes that starts with the menu music and never really ends. There is almost an overwhelming amount of little tricks they put in this game to make its polish shine. For starters, the dodge roll's animation isn't really a dodge roll so much as it's a Max Payne dive. It gives the gameplay a kind of action movie vibe as you dive into a room, flip over a table, and start blasting away everything. You wouldn't exactly expect a bullet-hell dungeon crawler roguelite to have cinematic gunfights, but somehow they managed it, mainly by animating spectacular explosions of rubbish that fly all over the place. The game engine hums smoothly along no matter how many sprites are littering the screen, and the basic shapes, silhouettes, speeds, and behaviors of bad guys are so distinct from the particles that it's near impossible for particle effects to block out enemies and bullets, even when the screen looks like this. And the process of figuring out how to deal with a bullet spread that dense is a satisfying endeavor. The gameplay here is just plain fun, and a lot of the reason why has to do with how gosh darn fast it plays. There are teleporters everywhere, every other room, and no penalty to using them, so you almost never have to release the movement buttons. Hell, spamming the dodge roll for a slight speed boost on your way to the next room actually makes good practice for learning the move. So even in that downtime, the game's still keeping you awake and twitchy. And that's just core design. Put the aesthetics under a microscope and the game is still searing with a mirror sheen. Notice how your gun doesn't match up 1-to-1 to aim at your cursor. Although the shot is accurate, your gun only rotates in notches, which lessens the ugly low-res sprite rotating effect from occurring. Enemy kills freeze the game for 1 frame, meaning you can feel when it's time to change targets in the middle of a firefight, but quick multiple kills don't produce this effect to keep it from feeling sluggish. Bullets that ricochet have tails, water casts reflections, lights cast shadows, lights can be shot out, the list goes on. As that list grew higher and higher, Gungeon came, at least for the first few hours, pretty darn close to getting me just as ready to love this genre as Necrodancer did. But as my list of spotted clever little tricks grew, so did a few, much more simple but somewhat damnable slip-ups start to appear on that list as well. Slip-up number 1 is the spawn rate of good stuff dropping in the first level, particularly a good gun before the first boss. Enter the Gungeon is a hard game, and unfortunately it's kind of a punishing one. The bosses are what most resemble its bullet hell influences. They're the ones who provide you the moments where you're zoning out into a space where you can only mash away your fire button at that general direction while purely focusing on dodging, which should be fine and is how shmups play, but unlike shmups, your playing space here has more corners and cover. It's too easy to get trapped in a nook so riddled with bullets that you can only dodge out of their way into other bullets. which is also fine. You got like 6 hits you can take and a couple screen-clearing bombs, so you can account for those moments, but whittle those resources down before a boss fight and, well, you're almost hopeless. I mean, look at this. Well, actually, it's not hopeless. Whittling away at them with your puny, underpowered starting gun is totally doable, but the process is so slow that it increases your chance of taking at least 1 hit by 1,000,000,000. The reason I mentioned this whole damage avoidance thing in the first place is because one of the very earliest challenges to unlock the first shortcut requires you to do bosses without taking hits. Which is funny because they almost always drop healing items after the battle, which encourages you to take a hit when you need to. But these bosses are so demanding of your resources that messing up slightly just once in the earlier levels can ruin your entire run. You know, the holy grail among most shmup enthusiasts, the qualifier that considers the game beaten, the thing that unlocks the true final boss, is a 1-credit clear, which implies that the player's allowed to take a hit or two. Considering Gungeon's intended audience and the kind of new ground they're treading here, I don't think it should be the case that this game's actually harder than the crazy super niche Japanese games it's calling back to. Though it won't let you know it, Gungeon is kinda confused about itself deep down inside. It's a sleek hybrid, it's smooth as hell and efficient too, but it doesn't really reach the strengths of either a good roguelite nor a good shmup. It's settling, and don't get me wrong, it's effectively executing on a perfectly acceptable hybrid between the two. But that means it's lacking in long-term strategy or depth. Rooms in Enter the Gungeon lock you in as soon as you pass a door's threshold. They're very, very walled-off spaces. Unlike most of the standard bearers of this type of game, the Gungeon isn't made out of a breakable substrate, so you can't blow away chunks of walls or tunnel your way directly to the boss, or preview an upcoming room and choose a different one instead. All of those would be cheap tricks, yes, but they're also still doable in these other super hard roguelites that still maintain a tough but fair difficulty. Those cheap tricks stand as evidence that their dungeons are built on dynamic, unpredictable layers of mechanical interactions, which Gungeon is kind of lacking in. It's not without esoteric secrets, hidden inputs to learn, and a need for careful resource management, but that's not the same as a strategic layer of depth underneath the core combat. There's an optimal strategy to all of those aspects. Once you learn the appropriate response to the appropriate stimulus, there's just not a lot of room for player creativity. Although it looks like I'm just wasting ammo here, I assure you this is a deliberate ritual and I'm making a net gain. In short, the overwhelming majority of the challenge is reflex. Barely any of it is mental. You just walk into a room, shoot everything, rinse and repeat. Which, hey, works for what they're going for, but try doing it for 20 hours. I have never hated a video game character more than I hate the Tinker right now. This guy unlocks your fast travel shortcuts for you, and his list of demands are either too long or too strenuous. He'll ask for an amount of supplies that sometimes barely even have a chance of spawning in at all.
No, I do not have $240 and 5 keys, and I'm offended that you think I do!
So as you go fill out his checklist, even the first task he gives you, you'll find yourself going through runs not taking a hit, not using any keys, not opening any chests, and remember how hard this game is in the first place. You gotta make it harder on yourself for the chance you might unlock some kind of progress, even early game progress at that. These aren't late game self-imposed challenges to try after mastering how the game works. You're asked to do these like 4 or 5 hours in. And the irony is that this blocks a feeling of progression. Spending pocket change on guns that may or may not spawn in later is nothing compared to the milestone of a win that these shortcuts are. Locking away these vital shortcuts behind such a high wall early on stops the feeling that the player is getting anywhere in the early game. All the other guys who give you side quests, they're fine, they're totally fine, but this guy is the problem. He is what makes the game ultimately feel repetitive and grindy. He is what makes the issues with its spawn rates and its dynamism noticeable in the first place. Which are problems I didn't really care about until after the 10th hour or so. Up until then, Gungeon was a damn good time, and I mean, really, it still is. The frustration of balance and randomization issues kinda comes with this genre, which I think is an unfortunate way to be making games for this genre, but ultimately a minor issue compared to just how good this game looks, feels, and sounds. I feel like I might have been playing it past its welcome, or maybe it wasn't built for being played past the 20-hour mark. After all, these games are built for 15 to 40-minute sessions, which means any complaints I have about late-game design issues don't mean that it's not a fine execution of a great idea. As a $15 dungeon-crawling dance party, it's definitely good for 15 hours of fun. It's a solid purchase, and you can expect to enjoy it. Just don't expect to beat it. And maybe expect to not enjoy it as much if you do end up going down that route.